The bill that Chairman Walden has developed, it's presently a discussion draft, but I think it'll be introduced shortly, would impose on the FCC certain procedural reforms. I want to just get on the table key elements of what the Walden bill would do. If the FCC wants to adopt or revise a regulation, of course it goes, now the Commission would go through a rulemaking process, and under the bill, as part of that rulemaking process, the Commission would be required to identify and analyze whether there's a market failure and whether there's actual consumer harm that the rule proposes to address. It would be required to make a reasoned determination concerning the cost and benefits of the proposed rule. And third, it would be required to make a reasoned determination that market forces and changes in technology are unlikely to resolve within a reasonable period of time the harm that presumably the rule is intending to address. You would expect the FCC to be doing these types of things anyway as part of its analysis. After all, it's concerned with markets. It's generally looking at how technology and the markets work together in order to benefit consumers, and whether consumers are protected. So, to my mind, the requirements that the bill proposes to add that the Commission would be required to do, and essentially these are analytical requirements, are things that we would expect the Commission to do. It does them sometimes, but you know, it seems to me at least, and many others, I think including Chairman Walden, that it doesn't always do these things. So I really increasingly have, over the last couple of years, have just come to think about this in terms of shifting the Commission's default position from regulation when in doubt to don't regulate when in doubt. Again, absent clear and convincing evidence that consumers are being harmed or that there's a market failure. The problem is the Commission has used that broad authority that it has to impose conditions on parties before it who are seeking approval of their transaction that aren't really uniquely related to the specifics of the transaction or the specific harm that may arise from the transaction. In fact, often some of the conditions that ultimately you see the parties come forward and offer, generally at the last minute, sort of midnight, quote, voluntary conditions, those conditions seem to be the type of conditions that, if they ought to be imposed at all, would only be appropriate in a generic rulemaking proceeding and applicable to all parties that are situated similarly, rather than the applicants before the Commission. So anyway, what Walden's bill would do, and it's very good on this point, you know, if nothing else happened in the world in the next couple of years, this would be a big improvement. It requires that any conditions imposed by the Commission in the context of a merger be specifically and uniquely related to the harm that the Commission suggests might arise from the merger. Chairman Walden has a companion bill. It's actually a separate piece of paper and separate bill. He would require that these various reports the Commission is required to compile on an annual basis or semi-annual basis, whatever it is, that those be combined in one annual report looking at marketplace competition. This would be a good thing because it would focus the commission, or we might even say force the commission to examine markets, without sort of the narrow band vision that it still seems to apply. This bill would modify the forbearance and regulatory review provisions in sections 10 and 11 of the Communications Act. What Representative Latta's bill now does is establish a rebuttable presumption that the requirements of a forbearance petition and regulatory review relief. This is the periodic regulatory review process the Commission is required to engage in, that regulatory relief ought to be granted absent clear and convincing evidence. Again, we're going back to that clear and convincing evidence standard, that the requirements of those sections of the Act aren't met. So this is very important to understand. What his bill does, and again, this is consistent with my proposal, it doesn't change the substantive standards that are in the forbearance provision, for example. In other words, the Commission still has to look at whether consumers are protected, whether competition is protected, whatever the current requirements are, they're not changed. But what it does, again, is just through this evidentiary presumption, it shifts the burden to the Commission to demonstrate by convincing evidence that the regulatory relief shouldn't be granted. I want to add one important point, and this is actually very important. Representative Latta's bill, in making a change to the forbearance and regulatory review provision, those provisions currently only apply to telecommunications carriers. Any change to those provisions to make regulatory relief more easily obtainable ought to apply to any entity that's subject to the Commission's jurisdiction. I don't think there's any principle, in fact, I'm pretty confident there's not, of administrative law that would suggest that it's not appropriate to adapt certain procedural requirements for an agency regulating a specific market segment or industry sector, so that those procedural requirements reflect what the mission of the agency ought to be. This is, I think, the key thing. For a long time, I thought that in today's environment, where we have increasing competition, we have rapid technological change, people debate at the margin whether how competitive markets are or how quickly technology is changing, but it's undeniable by most reasonable people that the markets the Commission is charged with looking at are becoming more competitive. Nevertheless, I think the Commission's default position continues to be, when in doubt, regulate. And it does that even absent clear and convincing evidence that there's a market failure or that there's consumer harm. We need an overhaul of the Act ultimately, but it's probably not going to happen, in the next few years. And I'm an optimist, but I think it's going to take a while. I do think in the meantime that reforms such as those that are contained in the Walden bill, and again, I want to emphasize Representative Latta's bill as well, that those types of reforms in the meantime, I think could be very important in trying to get the FCC, require the FCC to, let's say, adjust or comport its regulations more closely with what the actual market conditions are. And again, so that ultimately, when competition is sufficient in certain markets, the Commission will then default towards letting the marketplace protect the consumer rather than the other way around, generally defaulting towards regulation unless it's absolutely sure that we have marketplace competition.